So maybe you have to go all the way back, right? Bitcoin's a permissionless network, so anybody can use it for anything that they want. Do we agree on that statement?
No. So Bitcoin is permissionless as long as you're using Bitcoin in the normal way. If you're trying to use Bitcoin in an abusive way, or you're trying to change Bitcoin, then you have to get Bitcoiners' permission to do that. Bitcoin belongs to Bitcoiners. It doesn't belong to, shitcoiners. It belongs to people who hold Bitcoin, who operate Bitcoin. Yeah, Bitcoin is valuable because it protects the property rights of Bitcoiners.
But it's also a tool that anyone can use at any time, and that no one has to appeal to anyone else in order to use it as described by the protocol.
Right. You can use Bitcoin is permissionless if you're going to use it in a way that Bitcoiners are okay with, which is, you're using it for money, right? If you're using it for money, then you have everybody's permission to do that. If you're using it to stuff a bunch of garbage into, you don't have permission to do that. So Bitcoin is like, yes, it's permissionless, but only if you're using it in ways that Bitcoiners approve, right? Bitcoin is a consensus network. If you're trying to use it in a way that you didn't get consent, then you can't do that, or Bitcoiners are going to push back, right?
Well, maybe let's introduce this. There's a Preston Pish tweet that kind of became like another little bit of a lightning rod over the last week, where essentially he listed different types of arbitrary data use on Bitcoin. So maybe let's just talk about it. Like, are we litigating? We're not litigating the totality of arbitrary data use here, right? It sounds like that you would even concede that there are some uses of arbitrary data on the Bitcoin network that are, according to consensus, how Bitcoin should be used. We're not throwing out all arbitrary data uses on Bitcoin. Is that correct?
Well, so all arbitrary data detracts from Bitcoin's purpose, which is to be money, and competes with Bitcoin to do that. However, since
why do you draw it in?
Well, let me finish. So since 2014, there's been the Arbitrary, right? There's been a way to anchor data into the blockchain if you just want to put a hash into Bitcoin. And because you can take any like arbitrarily large piece of data and you can Merkle tree it down into a single hash, that's considered acceptable, because you're not really, if you just make a few of those per day, you're not really, crowding out actual monetary transactions from people actually trying to, for instance, run a shop as a merchant and accept Lightning, right? And in order to accept Lightning, of course, you have to open a channel. And if you're a poor merchant in Africa and you're trying to start a Phoenix wallet, you can't do that when there's a Rune attack and the fees are 100 sats per byte. You just can't afford it. You can't even start your shop. There's kind of a common misconception, and even among core developers, that because there's no demand for large op returns, we can just get rid of the op return limit and expect there to still be no large op returns. And what people are missing is that the limit is reducing economic demand for those transactions on Bitcoin. It functions the same as a fence around your property. If you have a fence around your property, you're doing that to discourage people from breaking into your house. If you have a fence, though, somebody can still break into your house. And so you see people on the pro spam side saying stuff like, well, a determined attacker could send a transaction to a miner and get their transaction, in a block anyway. And that's basically the same thing as arguing, oh, well, somebody can just climb over your fence. A determined attacker can just climb over the fence and get into your house. And it's like, well, yeah, but you increased the cost for them to do that, right? And actually you're increasing the cost a lot. So the canonical example is Rob Hamilton, like a year or two ago, was challenged to make a dust transaction and try to get around the dust limit. And so what ended up happening is he ended up taking 3 days to do this, and he ended up paying a fee that was 9 times higher than the regular rate. And so that shows that the filters are working. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. People are not even trying to do these transactions because the costs are so high. And so they're just like, well, I can just spam Ethereum instead. I'm not going to break into the house with a fence because there's a house right next door that doesn't have a fence.
Well, so a couple things there. I would say that we've seen that the demand for arbitrary data on Bitcoin gets really high, right? So during the Runes launch, for example, blocks were completely full, and there was fees. The fees on those blocks were in excess in some cases of 30 Bitcoin, right? So we've seen this idea that demand for these kind of transactions is so high, and even if you make them arbitrarily more expensive, people will pay those fees for whatever reason. Do you agree with that premise?
Yeah, I think if you don't have filters, so what happened is,
how did the filter actually prevent any activity if there was going to be so much fee pressure for these
No,
these
so those transactions were considered standard, right? So the hack that ordinals did is they made this inscription envelope that was technically standard but shouldn't have been, right? It was a bug in the Bitcoin protocol that the ordinals authors were exploiting. And then the Bitcoin core developers did not close this bug, but they should have. Okay, so basically BRC20, and this is how the UTXO stat went from 4 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes. This hack was exploited in order to use standardness rule. So ordinal transactions were considered standard. You know, even though they shouldn't have been, they were considered standard. And so there was this huge flood of Ponzi's that went out. Oh, you know, it's like a gold rush for like scamming, right? And they saw this entrance. Oh, we can do these Ponzi's on Bitcoin because Bitcoin has this bug that we can exploit. And so they all rushed into that gap because there was no fence there, right? There was a big gap in the fence.
But there's also no, so right now as we speak, like it is very incredibly cheap, almost the complete minimum cost to send a transaction on Bitcoin, right? We would agree to put that
for now.
So
yeah. Yeah, but that's just a temporary situation. I mean, we didn't do anything to actually fix the bug. The bug is still there. The ordinals guys or some other like variation on ordinals could just come back and add another 8 gigabytes.
Negative effect, but there wasn't any negative effects to these waves of things happening other than the UTXOs like got slightly larger. I mean,
that's
otherwise,
a huge negative impact. So I was working at Start9 at the time, and it used to be that you could sync a Raspberry Pi 4B with 4 gigabytes of RAM in like a week or two. And that was like, it was like $100, $150. And then after the spam attacks, those computers could no longer sync Bitcoin in a reasonable amount of time. It took over a month to sync those nodes. And so what happened is the minimum cost to run a Bitcoin node went up. Okay, this is unthinkable. Like we should. This is a huge problem. The technological advancement increases exponentially. It should be getting faster and faster and faster to sync a node. And yet, with Bitcoin Core's architecture that relies on the UTXO set being small, the cost of running a node is going up. This is a disaster. People need to understand this is a calamity. We need to do something about this.
But you can't really do much about the cost of entry to the Bitcoin network as a whole because it's a permissionless network. The same way that with Bitcoin miners, Bitcoin became more expensive to be a Bitcoin miner over time. This is just the cost of entry to the system. There's
no what I'm saying is the cost is going up, and so what that means is that Bitcoin is going to become more centralized.
But it's always run nodes. Why wouldn't it always go up? There's always more data being added to the chain.
Because technological advancement is exponential, okay? And blockchain growth is linear. And so what you would expect is technology to eventually outstrip the growth of the blockchain, which actually could happen with Bitcoin Core's current architecture, as long as we get lucky and somehow don't have a bunch of spam attacks. But getting rid of the opportune limits makes this less likely.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're arguing. I just feel like there's a lot of layers to this, and it's hard to know like where to directly address things. So I agree with you that it's good that nodes are cheap to run, and ideally we want that.
And they should be getting cheaper over time. Otherwise, like the node network is very centralized right now. It's like 10 or 20,000 nodes. Like we need every merchant node to be able to run a node. We need every Bitcoin accepting merchant to be able to run a node. Maybe you remember in 2017, in the block size wars, we talked about the economic majority. We talked about economic nodes. We need as many economic nodes as possible. And if the costs for merchants to run a node is increasing over time, then the node network is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller of economic nodes. And then what's going to happen? The miners are just going to run all over everybody.